Business Law Obligations Part 2. Obligation not to do. Negative personal obligation. When the obligation consists in not doing, and the obligor does what has been forbidden him, it shall be undone at his expense. If the debtor will do an act which is prohibited by the agreement, the remedy of the creditor is to file an action in court to prevent the debtor from doing it. Sources of liability from damages. The sources of liability from damages are fraud, negligence, delay, and contravention of the tenor of the obligation. Fraud is intentional deception to evade the performance of an obligation. The kind of fraud referred to herein is incidental fraud, and the remedy of injured party is to demand for damages. Causal fraud refers to insidious words or machination employed by one party to induce another to enter into contract, without which he would not have agreed to. It makes the consent of the defrauded party defective and the contract is voidable. The remedy of injured party in this case of causal fraud is to file action to the annulment of the contract. When a person has a duty under the law to reveal something, but he did not disclose it, he is considered guilty of fraud by concealment, and he shall be liable for damages. Under the law, an agent has the obligation to reveal to his principal everything that transpired in his transactions. If he will hide something which is prejudicial to the interest of the principal, he shall be liable for damages based on the fraud by concealment. Negligence is the omission of the diligence required by the nature of an obligation and correspondence to the circumstances of the person, time, and place. The debtor shall be liable for damages if he will fail to perform his obligation, or the thing will be lost, or damage due to his fault or negligence. However, if the failure of the debtor to perform his obligation is due to fortuitous event, he shall not be liable and his obligation shall be extinguished. The general rule is, there is no liability for fortuitous event. Fortuitous events are those events which could not be foreseen, or which, though foreseen, were inevitable. The obligation of D is to deliver C his car with plate number XYZ428 on August 10, 2006. On August 2, 2006, the said car was totally destroyed when the acacia tree which was hit by lightning fell on it. The obligation of D in this case is extinguished because his car was lost due to fortuitous event. This rule is not absolute, and the debtor shall still be liable for non-performance of the obligation or loss of the thing due because of fortuitous event or without his fault, if it is stipulated by the parties, if the law provides, or the nature of the obligation requires assumption of risk. For example, if D and C in the previous example agree that D will be liable for 100,000 if he will not be able to deliver the car on the maturity date for whatever reason, then D's obligation will not be extinguished and he should pay 100,000. If D failed to deliver his car on August 10, 2006 after the demand made by C and subsequently it was lost to fortuitous event, D's obligation will not be extinguished because under the law the debtor shall be liable for fortuitous event when he is already in delay, or the insurance company shall be liable for the payment of the insurance proceeds if the car of D is insured because the obligation of insurance company requires an assumption of risk. It should be noted that only specific thing can be lost. A generic thing cannot be lost. Hence, if the obligation is to give an indeterminate thing, the loss of the same kind, even through the fortuitous event, will not extinguish the obligation. Delay or default is the non-performance of the obligation after demand. Generally, the debtor incurs no delay if he fails to perform his obligation on the date agreed upon, unless the creditor makes a demand. This is so because on maturity date, the right of the creditor to demand personal right begins so. And if the creditor does not make a demand for the performance of the obligation on the maturity date and after, it gives rise to the presumption that he is giving the debtor an allowance of time for the performance of his obligation. The general rule is no demand, no delay, except in reciprocal obligation, when one is ready but the other is not, delay by other begins. When time is essential motive in the establishment of the obligation, when the obligation so provides, when the law declares, and when demand would be useless. Contravention of the tenor of the obligation. As previously discussed, the debtor must comply with what it is incumbent upon him. Otherwise, he shall be liable for damages. This is in accordance with the provision that the contract binds both contracting parties and that the debtor must honestly and faithfully comply with what has been agreed upon. Different kinds of obligation. Different kinds of obligation are pure obligation, conditional obligation, obligation with a period, joint obligation, solidary obligation, alternative obligation, facultative obligation, divisible obligation, indivisible obligation, and obligation with penal clause. Pure obligation is one which is not subject to period or condition and is demandable at once. An obligation is also demandable at once if it's subject to a resolutory condition or period. D promised to give a Parker pen to C. The obligation of D is immediately demandable because it is pure. An obligation is also demandable at once if it's subject to the resolutory condition or period. D promised to lend all his review materials in business law to C until the latter passes CPA board examination. C can demand at once for those review materials and use them until the passes the CPA board examination. After passing the examination, C must return those review materials because the obligation is subjected to a resolutory condition. Conditional obligation is one, the demandability of which is subject to a future or uncertain event or past event unknown to the parties. Kinds of condition. Potestative condition is one which is dependent upon the sole will of the debtor. It is void, and the obligation dependent upon it shall also be void. D will give a card to C if D will enroll in a second semester school year 2006-2007. That is void. Suspensive condition is one on the demandability of which is dependent upon the fulfillment or happening of the condition. D will give a new cell phone to C if C will pass the October 2006 CPA board examination. Resolutory condition is one which is demandable at once but an obligation is extinguished upon the happening of the condition. D agreed to allow D to use his car until it finishes the review for October 2006 board exam. Causal condition is one which is dependent upon chance. D will give 50 pesos to C if it will rain tomorrow. Mixed condition is one which is both dependent upon chance and upon the will of third person. D will give wristwatch to C if Jose and Maria will marry this year. Hence, the fulfillment of the condition is dependent upon the will of Jose and Maria and also upon chance because either of them may die or marry another before the end of the year. Impossible condition is one which cannot really take place, either because of its nature, physical impossibility, or because it is prohibited by law, legal impossibility. An impossible condition renders an obligation dependent upon it void. D will pay 1 million to C if C can draw a round triangle. Physically impossible. D will pay 100,000 to C if C will kill his wife. Legally impossible. A condition not to do an impossible thing shall be disregarded and the obligation becomes pure. D will give a gold necklace to C if C will not sell the Pasig River to X. Not to do an impossible thing. Here, a condition shall be disregarded and the obligation becomes pure and demandable at once. The conditional obligation to give is retroactive effect. In conditional obligation to give, once the condition is fulfilled, the effect shall retroact to the day of the constitution of the obligation. However, if the obligation imposes a reciprocal prestation upon the parties, the fruits and interest during the pendency of the obligation shall be deemed to have been mutually compensated. If the obligation is unilateral and the fruits and interest received during the pendency of the condition shall belong to the debtor unless otherwise stipulated. On January 3, 2005, S and B agreed in writing that S will sell his house and lot to B for 1 million if B will pass the CPA board examination in May 2006. B passed the May board examination. In this case, B is entitled to the house and lot as S is entitled to the price of 1 million effective January 3, 2005 when the obligation was constituted. However, the fruits of the house and the lot and interest of the purchase price from January 2005 to May are deemed mutually compensated. Alright? In the above example, if S agreed to donate his house and lot to B, cannot demand the fruits of the house and lot from January 2005 to May 2006. In the above example, if S agreed to donate his house and lot to B, B cannot demand for the fruits of the house and lot from January 2005 to May 2006 unless from the nature and other circumstances of the obligation it should be inferred that the intention of S is different. Obligation with a period. A period is a certain space of time which determines the effectivity of extinguishment of the obligation. The right of the creditor to demand for the performance of an obligation subject to suspensive period begins on arrival of the period. An obligation subject to resolutory period is demandable and at once, but upon the arrival of the period, the obligation is extinguished. Generally, the period agreed upon by the parties is for the benefit of both debtor and creditor, unless from the tenor of the obligation or other circumstances it appears that the period has been established in favor of one or the other. Hence, the creditor cannot demand performance and the debtor cannot pay before the arrival of the period. However, the debtor shall lose the right to the period, and therefore the creditor can demand in performance before the maturity date in the following instances: when a debtor becomes insolvent, when a debtor failed to furnish the promised guarantee, when the guarantee given is impaired through the debtor's fault or loss due to fortuitous event, when the debtor violates any undertaking agreed upon with the creditor, when the debtor attempts to abscond. When the debtor binds himself to pay when his means permits him to do so, the obligation is with the period, and the remedy of the creditor is, in case of debtor always alleges that he has no ability to pay, is to ask the court to fix the period. D promised to pay his loan to C once his buy and sell business become profitable. 5 years pass and still the business of D has not become profitable. C can file the case to court to ask for the fixing of the period within which D must pay. There are 3 instances when the court shall fix the period: when a period is intended but is not fixed by the parties, when a period depends upon the debtor's will, potestative period, and when the debtor binds himself to pay when his means permits him to do so. Distinction between period and condition. Period is certain while condition is uncertain. Period is always future, while condition may refer to past events unknown to the parties. Potestative period is valid, while potestative condition is void. Alternative obligation is one where there are several prestations, but the complete performance of one is sufficient satisfaction of the obligation. The right of choice generally belongs to the debtor, but it may expressly granted to the creditor. The creditor cannot be compelled to accept part of one and part of the other. If the debtor has the right of choice, but some of the alternative object was lost due to his fault, he can choose from the remaining prestations. If all the alternative objects of the obligations were lost due to his fault, he shall pay damages based on the last thing which was lost or the last service which became impossible. If the creditor is given the right to choose, but all the alternative objects of the obligation were lost due to the debtor's fault, the creditor has the right to demand for the value of any of the lost thing or services plus damages. If only one or some of the alternative objects were lost, the creditor may choose from the remaining objects plus damages, or demand for the value of any of the lost thing plus damages. Facultative obligation is one where there is only one prestation agreed upon, but the debtor is given the right to render another in substitution. In this kind of obligation, only one debtor has the right of choice, which right cannot be transferred to the creditor. For the consideration of $15,000, he agreed to deliver 14-inch Sony TV set to C July 7, 2006. They also agreed that D may deliver C radio watch in his computer set or his gold bracelet instead of the TV set. Note, in alternative and facultative obligation, the choice made becomes effective only once it has been communicated to the other. After its communication, the obligations become simple and it ceases to be alternative or facultative.